In the winter of 1869, when London's fog lay like a second skin upon the city, and coal smoke stitched itself into every corner of the mind, Dr. Ambrose Hale, a young, fastidious, and newly appointed deputy coroner for Middlesex, found himself unmoored from the tidy expectations of his profession. He had taken the post with an appetite for procedure and precedent, a hunger to make sense of the human facts that lingered after breath had ceased. He imagined neat ledgers, crisp inquest statements, and the consolation of causes named: consumption, accident, suicide. Instead, he discovered a pattern that refused to be named. It began, as such things often do, with a mistake. A district infirmary sent a body, an unremarkable male, no identity given to his office for examination. The attending nurse, in haste and apology, attached a scrap of paper with the legend unclaimed, St. Bartholomew's, and a faint, smudged signature. The corpse, however, told another story. The skin at the nape bore a neat incision, sutured in a way that suggested the hand which made it was practiced and steady. The cartilage beneath the ear had been crudely, then meticulously altered. There were no signs of post-mortem trauma beyond these marks. No bruising, no evidence of struggle. Yet the alterations were not the crude theatrics of an amateur. They were precise, surgical, and, to Ambrose's eye, remarkably consistent with a technique he had read of only in the most recondite medical treatises, the removal and grafting of tissues to change outward identity. He was troubled, but, at first, not alarmed. People crafted their features in life, patching teeth, changing hair. So surely death might be the last ground for the same vanity or necessity. He recorded the body as altered possible medico-legal manipulation, sealed the file, and let it rest beneath the weight of other inquests. Had not his superior, Mr. Ellery, cautioned him in their first week about the seduction of seeing pattern where chance sufficed. Chance, however, declined to be accommodating. 2 weeks later, a second corpse arrived, this one from a county infirmary north of the city. Another adult male, another band of healed incisions at precisely the nape and behind the ears, as though an invisible tailor had been taking measurements against the skull. The ledger entries, when cross-checked, gave little away. Found deceased, lodging house refused by relatives, interred as unknown. Still, the handiwork struck Ambrose with the force of a repeating motif in music, an insistence that cried out for harmony or discord. He began to ask discreet questions. Which surgeons had been on duty at the infirmaries? Were there private practitioners who serviced multiple institutions? He made careful visits quiet, methodical. In half-lights and curtained halls of provincial infirmaries, he met matrons who spoke in kibbed, defensive tones. In the city's apothecaries, he found men who refused to make records more generous than the coins they par. Gathered, each time, a new body followed within a fortnight. 3, then 4, always the same pattern of scar and graft. Ambrose's suspicions hardened into conviction when he received, by post and unsigned, a photograph. It was small, the sort of carte de visite carried in a gentleman's breast pocket. The subject was a man in his 30s, bold cheekbones. A scar fainted the jaw. It had been cropped so that only the head and upper chest remained, and beneath the image a single line had been penciled: "Observe the nape." He did. Under lamplight, he found the faintest whisper of the incision he had seen in the corpses, a delicate arc where the skin might be separated from the skull, small undermining sutures that, if made while life remained, suggested an artisan's patience. There was also something else in the photograph, a small, almost imperceptible number stamped at the back, ink worn thin by handling. 47. 47. Ambrose turned the notion in his mind like a coin. He checked ledger boxes and surgeons' registries, hospital staff lists, and apprenticeships. He found a name recurring across time and place: Professor Jeremiah Langford, M.D., Fellow of the Royal Society of Surgeons. Langford had the kind of eminence that cast long shadows lectures at the college, treatises on anatomy admired for their clarity, portraits hung in the halls of his alma mater. He also held a private practice that catered to clients of wealth and discretion. Ambrose had seen the professor's discreet card in the pocket of an undertaker once he had noted, with the professional cruelty of his generation, how haste softened aristocratic edges. If Langford was the link, the problem became more vexing. Language of respect and reputation kept him insulated. Langford's name would not be whispered in the infirmary wards, yet his practice might neatly explain how alterations reached beyond the Saturday salons of the city into the slow provincial caskets of the counties. Ambrose decided to observe rather than accuse. He attended Langford's public lectures when he could secure admittance, often through exchanges of civility with the older men who admired the professor's calm, deliberate explanations of human structure. Langford spoke of bones with the reverence of a priest and the candor of a mathematician. He demonstrated dissection with such immaculate cleanness that Ambrose found himself thinking of art rather than medicine. After one lecture, Ambrose lingered near the vestibule, tracing the lines of the professor's gait as the carriage rolled him away into the fog. It was the carriage that presented the first opportunity. A sudden, ugly accident, two hansom cabs colliding near Fleet Street, left a man crushed and ejected into the cold, the press gathering like birds. Ambrose, always quick in cases of trauma, pushed through the crowd and found the attendants already gathering. But the strangest of these men was small, gloved, and precise, with a tipped beard and spectacles that caught the lamplight and made him look like a hawk. He issued swift directions, soft but exacting, to the coroners and policemen alike. Ambrose recognized him then, the compact silhouette and austere mouth of one of Langford's senior demonstrators, Mr. Edwin March, a man of excellent pedigree in teaching, and, some whispered, close to the professor's, confidence. Ambrose followed March into the back of St. David's Infirmary under the pretense of administrative procedure. The crushed man, whose face had been cleaned and prepared, would need a formal examination before burial. March stood by, cool and interested, making what one might call civil inquiries about the method of transport and the condition of the deceased. He handled the deceased's features with a familiarity that stirred Ambrose, and when his gloved fingers touched the jaw, Ambrose noticed, as if by a reflex shared between two anatomists, March's fingers paused over a place where a scar would be, had it existed. The pause was curious. The man turned away almost at once, as if embarrassed by an involuntary knowledge. What followed was a clandestine exchange of courtesy and suspicion. March accepted Ambrose's invitation to a private viewing of the corpse in the presence of the coroner's staff. He was polite, articulate, and yet careful, his answers erect, as if a guard duty was ever present. Ambrose watched him, as one watches a clockwork device, neatly wound, predictable until a spring slips. March's presence was not a confession, not yet. It was a compass, the point that would direct Ambrose to a map he did not yet understand. For months, Ambrose worked through this net of quiet complicity. He pored over ledgers, dates, locations, the faint stamp of 47 on certain admission tickets, the odd appearance of travel warrants that suggested relatives who existed only on paper. He visited graveyards at dusk, St. Pancras, Highgate, the small parish grounds that absorbed the city's nameless. In every place he searched, he found a tidy economy of anonymity, stones raised with similar chisel marks, coffins of the same style, undertakers who assumed every question was a veiled insult. What began to emerge was not criminality of the common sort, but an apparatus, almost professional in its cruelty. Corpses arrived at his office with altered face and ears, the grafts hidden beneath the hair or at the shadow of a collar. The sutures were so clean that they suggested not haste. Ambrose, who had been trained in comparative anatomy and had assisted in many dissections, recognized in those sutures the patient strokes of a practiced instructor. He also discerned something else. The alterations were intended not merely to change a visage, but to erase recognizability in a particular way, adjusting the features just enough that any informal identification would fail. It was as though the hand that altered a face did not wish merely to make the person anonymous, but to reroute identity into an indeterminate elsewhere. At last, a clue arrived that could be followed with the clarity of an arrow. One body bore, under an old patch of skin, a tattoo, something crude and faint, a number and a letter scrawled in haste. It read, unmistakably, 47A. Ambrose's heart quickened as he turned to the registries. 47 had been the index on the professor's carte de visite. 47A, someone had it in a clerk's hand on a distant ledger. He cross-checked and found other marginalia. 47B, 47C. They appeared like catalogue tags in the margins of death. Ambrose applied for and received, through the diligence of an ally in the registrar's office, an old apprenticeship list. The College of Surgeons kept a registry of apprentices and assistants who had trained under its fellows. Most names were straightforward. Among them, however, he found the name carefully underlined of Jeremiah Langford's private pupils. The list included many legitimate men, but one entry stood out: a cohort apprenticed under the heading Clinical Restoration, a scarcely used term in the register, the more so because the college did not sanction such a discipline. The apprentices in that list had, beside their names, numbers: 47, 47A, 47B. The match was too neat to be coincidence. Ambrose's path to Langford's private rooms was not a direct one. He began by talking to those who had known Langford before his renown, a physician who had once shared student lodgings with him, an old charwoman who cleaned his rooms, an erstwhile demonstrator who had left medicine for the genteel insolvency of municipal clerkship. From them he learned two things. First, that Langford taught with an aestheticism bordering on obsession. Second, that in his younger years he had travelled on the continent, bringing back with him techniques whispered of in the salons of Paris, imaginative, radical approaches to anatomy and restoration. He had, they implied, without making the implication explicit, but taste for perfection. The door to Langford's house opened for Ambrose through the kind curiosity of a midwife named Mrs. Havisham. She had, in her youth, delivered the professor's only niece, and spoke of Langford with a complex affection reserved for those who had given small comforts in great lives. Through her, Ambrose gained an invitation to a lecture demonstration at Langford's private rooms, an event, she assured him, attended by men of honour and thought, not the vulgar curiosity of public exhibitions. Langford's rooms were exactly as one would imagine, oak-panelled, smelling faintly of spirit and old paper, anatomical models posed like quiet trophies on shelves. The professor himself was, as the portraits indicated, long-snouted, incisive, with the air of a man who believed the world to be a system of pieces to be arranged. He spoke with polite grandeur of the body as an object of knowledge and of art. His demonstrators march among them moved with discreet efficiency, their gloved hands like instruments in a seamless orchestra. It was there, after a demonstration of reconstructive suturing so exact that a mere skin graft appeared as if it had always belonged to the form, that Ambrose encountered the apprentices. Young men in their 20s and 30s, neat, pale, with the quiet of those who spend much time in rooms where the dead are props for living learning. Their names were polite and proper: Carlyle, Brinsley, Morton, their hands steady. They were introduced, formally, as students of techniques and restorations. Langford called the work clinical restoration, a phrase that rose and settled in the air like an incense. It sounded at first rational and necessary, useful for disaster victims and the casualties of industry. He spoke of reconstructing faces torn by accidents, of returning to life a semblance of dignity through sutures and grafts. Ambrose nodded in the necessary way, listening as a deputy coroner should, while inwardly matching the professor's rhetoric to the mortal evidence he had seen on his tables. The classes continued. The demonstrators practiced upon cadavers with a flourish, turning sorrow into craft. Ambrose watched March teach the men how to alter ears, how to undermine skin without breaking bones, how to layer and hide grafts beneath hairlines so that the corpse's face looked as if it had been born like any other. When Ambrose asked simple procedural questions about consent, about the chain of custody for bodies, Langford spoke of beneficence. He declared, with a quiet dignity, that the bodies used for instruction were often unclaimed, the paupers of hospitals who would otherwise be lost to anatomical ignorance. Ambrose had always respected the value of the unclaimed body to knowledge. Nevertheless, he felt a prickle of disquiet. What made the disquiet congeal into conviction was what happened on a night when the gaslight outside snuffed with the wind and the students lingered longer than was proper. Ambrose, whose staff had given him access to the anatomy room on a formal pretext of inspection, entered softly to check the instruments. What he found should have been merely professional, a room full of mannequins and fresh specimens. Instead, in the dim, he noticed a chest of small lined drawers, catalogue cases used to store instruments, each drawer labelled in Langford's neat hand, by numbers 47, 47A, 47B. When he pulled open one, he found, wrapped in linen and smelling faintly of disinfectant, a small parcel of old hair and a strip of skin carefully preserved and stitched in such a way that it could be applied to another face with minimal alteration. Ambrose realized then that Langford's clinical restoration was not merely reconstructive. Langford taught a particular skill, the altering of identity by rearranging the face in death. The drawers held what were, practically, masks made from the detritus of earlier bodies, preserved and catalogued. The implication was monstrous, a system not for the restoration of accidents, but for the forging of transferable visages, materials kept in order, as if in a workshop for the erasure of persons. He took a drawer to his nose and found a faint smell of emollient and something else, old tobacco, perhaps, and a residue that matched the traces he had seen beneath the sutures in the county bodies. His stomach turned, for he had seen enough of life's cruelty to know the economies it required. A hypothesis formed with cold clarity. Langford's pupils were learning how to manufacture anonymity for the dead in a way that could be traded or assigned, to obliterate identifiability, and thus to make certain deaths, discrete deaths, untraceable. Ambrose's next course was illegal even by the softer standards of the day, yet inaction felt worse. He began to shadow the demonstrators discreetly, watching as their bare carriages, after the lessons, queued in the side alleys of Langford's house and rolled out toward the poorer wards. At first, Ambrose could not prove complicity. Then he found someone who could speak without fear. A lonely porter named Hobb, who had once worked under Langford's household staff and had been dismissed for reasons he would not explain. Hobb had watched the workshop from the service stairs. He told, in a voice that trembled between loyalty and fear, of bodies coming in from infirmaries, of instructions whispered names that should be eliminated, relatives who should be dissuaded, and of a network of influence that extended to undertakers and magistrates. "What's done to him, sir?" Hobb asked on a Tuesday evening in a tobacco-stinking alehouse, where Ambrose had promised discretion with coin and sympathy. Why the right sort come and take them. "I seen 'em put a mark on an admission roll, take a body that's yet warm, and send word to an undertaker to bury as unknown. I seen numbers sewn into seams. I seen the coachman paid. And I seen a ledger in Langford's room, names like yours, sir, that don't belong to the poor. Ah, and that." Ambrose wrapped the stories together. The apprentices with their numbers, the drawers of preserved tissue, the card stamped with 47. What he had once thought an aberrant interest in cosmetic perfection now revealed a darker appetite. If skilled hands could alter a body to render it unidentifiable, then certain deaths could be expunged from family histories, debts, or legal obligations. A man might disappear from the books, not by murder alone, but by the frictionless collaboration of those who knew how to fasten a bar. Face into a new, unrecognizable whole, he moved to confront Langford with evidence. The discourse he had rehearsed in his mind, equations of professional ethics and legal obligation, fell apart upon actual conversation. Langford, when accosted directly in his study, received Ambrose with a gracious smile and the deliberate calm of a man who had studied human indignation. He did not deny the specifics. Instead, he reframed them. "You assume," Langford said softly, sitting as lamps threw out ovals of golden light, "that our work has only one moral calculus. We are professional men. We relieve the living of discomfort. We relieve the dead of indignity. A man who cannot be claimed at his death is nevertheless a bridge to knowledge. I teach technique because it is necessary. Do you not repair a bowed limb so that a man may walk? Is this not akin?" Ambrose was not moved by the parable. "You teach how to erase identity," he said. "You keep tissues and catalogues, words like 47, like a merchant does stock, men who should be identifiable, rendered otherwise. This is not restoration. It is, in many cases, theft of the public record." Langford's expression hardened, not from maliciousness, but from the conviction of a man who had convinced himself of the rightness of his acts. There are inconveniences in life that the public record need not contain, he said. There are estates to be saved, reputations to be kept whole. You are a coroner. You know how the law clutches at scandal like a child at a toy. We offer others a merciful erasure. What harm is there in repair? Ambrose felt, with a sudden and horrible clarity, how attractive Langford's rationalization would be to the powerful. The means of making a death tidy, expunging social embarrassment with the scalpel's neatness. He thought of those unclaimed bodies, a man who had been mistreated by a magistrate and then disappeared, a woman whose family shunned her, a laborer whose wages were claimed by creditors. The clinical restoration that Langford sold as mercy might, in practice, be a tool for aristocratic convenience. "You need cover," Ambrose said. You need a means to send these altered bodies where the law will not follow. Langford smiled, and with the smile came the small, revealing twist of humour. We already have it, Dr. Hale. The magistrates dislike bothering with the poor. Undertakers prefer a gentle fee to the trouble of inquests. We offer both discretion and a small kindness. Do you suppose all our pupils are blackguards? They are men of ability. They will make death gentler. Ambrose left the house with the taste of mint and vinegar in his mouth. The debate inside him was no longer whether Langford broke the law he had, and whether that breakage could be proven beyond the reasonable doubt required by a court. The greater terror was the destabilizing realization that the system itself would permit, and perhaps collude in, such disappearances. Langford operated in a social hedge. Wealthy patrons who wanted things forgotten, magistrates who had little stomach for protracted scandal, undertakers who preferred a fat check to the annoyance of evidence. If he had only been altering the faces of the unclaimed poor, Ambrose might have closed the case with moral revulsion. But the professor's roster of clients, whispers of gentlemen who preferred certain debts to vanish, suggested the work of a wider, more deliberate erasure. He resolved to return with legal force. Ambrose wrote, with the steady hand that had read ledger and corpse, a petition to the College of Surgeons and to the coroner's inquest board. He enclosed testimony from Hobb, the photocopies of the apprenticeship lists, and the inventory of Langford's drawers. He requested a formal investigation. The reply, when it fell 2 weeks later, was a ceremonial denial. The college professed confidence in the professor's character and declared the petition insufficient. The inquest board thanked Ambrose for his vigilance and advised restraint. The names that needed protecting had power. Anger and despair warred within him. Ambrose had a duty to the dead, to their names, and to the families who might have a right to know. But in the folk-sleek halls of mid-level office holders, a man's ethics could be blunted by a word from a peer. We mustn't intrude. One could imagine the quiet meeting rooms where decisions were made in tones that suggested principle, but meant convenience. It was then that the twist to smaller private treachery arrived from a place Ambrose had not expected. Ambrose received, after a lonely night in his office, a second cartovitsite. This one bore the same head as the earlier photograph, but now the penciled line beneath it read simply, "Remember." On the margin, in a different hand, were the words, "I can help you if you will consider what you ask." The card, its edges blurred by wet, had been dropped at his feet without signature. Ambrose held it until numbness coiled in his fingers. He had come to distrust secrets, but also to hunger for allies. The card suggested both. He followed the lead of the unsigned plea. The handwriting, when compared to the college records, suggested a different source. It matched a clerk's hand in the registrar's office, a timid man named Mr. James Kett, a keeper of files who had once, when Ambrose needed a record, allowed him to search a locked drawer. Kett was easy to find. He was a donkey among the office boys, sleeping at his desk, the smell of pipe tobacco and old paper his permanent companion. In the dim of a back alley, Kett revealed his own small courage, and a truth more intimate than institutional complicity. He had been one of Langford's pupils once, in those years before reputations had hardened into brow. Riches. He had known, he confessed with some shame, what it meant to be taught how to make a person unrecognizable. He had left the practice when his conscience and his marriage demanded it. He had carried over the years a guilt that had been a constant weight. Kett's voice was little more than a rasp. the syllables kipped by fear and the cold. He told Ambrose, in words that at first were slow and stumbling and then, with a kind of relieved fury, flowed quicker, of how Langford's private classes had begun in earnest after the continent, how certain operations of restoration proved useful not merely for accident victims, but for those seeking to dissolve awkward das. Attachments. Ket spoke of the numbering system, 47 for Langford's cohort, appended letters for individual specimens and clients. We kept samples, he said, touching the paper between them, as if to reassure himself the ledger existed still. Horror, sir, perhaps. But the master told us it was mercy. I told myself that at the time. Why speak now? Ambrose asked. Ket's hands shook. I have a daughter, he said simply. A sickly child. Langford's men came to my door, once presented me with a manner of relief, if I should humbly ask it. I refused. They were polite. But I have heard the whispers about a certain family that had a tragedy and was suddenly relieved of certain obligations. I kept quiet because I thought it above me. Then I saw your petition and knew somebody must stop it. Ambrose felt the magnitude of the moment settle upon him like wet cloth. Ket had resources, a knowledge of the hidden doors, the tags on the drawers, the benches where bodies were passed like objects of craft. He knew the alleyways where Langford's men stored specimens and carried them to waiting coaches. Kent offered to lead Ambrose to one such cache, to the rooms where the drawers were kept beyond the polished oak of Langford's reception. They moved on a bitter morning when the fog made the city seem to stand still. Ket led Ambrose through a succession of backways, past warehouses where men coughed black, and where the stench of tanneries made the eyes water. At the end of a lane that smelt of brine and coal, they arrived at a low brick mews, a place that had once served as a livery. Within the mews stood a small, unmarked house, the windows shuttered, and the door blocked with a cart. Ket produced a key with fingers that trembled but did not fail him. Inside, the air was astonishingly clean. Shelves lined the walls, and boxes, bundles of linen and lids were stacked with the precision of a surgeon's mind. Ambrose recognized, with a cold shock, the linen-wrapped parcels he had seen in Langford's drawers. There were tags nailed to the shelves. 47, 47A, 47C, and there, on a table, a ledger, open, as if the hand that wrote it had stepped out only for a moment. The ledger listed names, given names, sometimes initials, and in a neighboring column, the explanation, obliteration agreed, neutralization of identity. No kin asserted. Fees were recorded with the exactness of a tradesman. Ambrose turned cold, not for the brutality of the contents, but for the ordinariness of the administration, the language of commerce, the neat arithmetic, the lack of flourish. Death had been processed as any other matter of exchange. He leafed through pages, and his eye caught a name that knocked him with force. H. Ellery, his own superior, the man who had once told him not to look too deeply into Patton. Bellery's entry read, family obligations redacted, fee rendered in trust, completed. The ledger used different words for different ranks, completed for the wealthy, final for the poor, but the function remained identical. Ambrose felt fury and betrayal like wind. He thought of the times Ellery had smiled in meetings, of the way he had chastised Ambrose for obsession. In one quick, irrational beat, he felt foolish for having been so naive as to trust the mechanisms of civility. The ledger proved what suspicion had only conjectured, that a network of professionals, surgeons, coroners, undertakers, magistrates worked in a commerce of forgetting. They should have fled. They did not. As they closed the ledger, footsteps approached soft, precise. A light fell across the doorway, and Edwin March stood there, his face a pale moon in the gloom. "You are curious men," March said, his voice measured as ever. "Mr. Kett, you disappoint me." The room tightened like a noose. Ambrose, who had never been a man of violence, felt the obviousness of his predicament. The two of them, in a room full of a dozen implicating documents, standing before a cadre trained in secrecy. March kept the door and spoke like a gentleman who had rehearsed this exact moment of exposure. "Dr. Hale," he said, addressing Ambrose by the professional name that suggested rank, "you have gone remarkably far for a deputy coroner. You should know that Langford's work is not for vulgar courts. It is for the preservation of order. You may do us the courtesy of stepping away now." Ambrose's reply was brave. "I will not abandon this," he said. "These men, your clients, have had their names erased without due process." March smiled, and behind the smile there was a hardness that Ambrose had not previously known. "You speak of the law," he said. "Observe, then, that we possess other laws, the laws of discretion, among gentlemen which you, as a man of sensibilities, should appreciate. It is not illegal to make a person unidentifiable. What is unlawful is to implicate those who ensure the smooth functioning of society." Kett, backing toward the door, tripped and fell, the sound of linen and wood sharp in the hush. March moved like a cat, quick and clinical, and plucked the ledger from the table. He sauntered to the window and, without haste, tossed it into the Mews stove, where the paper curled and crinkled and began to burn with a small, bright intentness. Ambrose felt an animal revolt. He grabbed for a chair to block March's path, but March, with the easy force of an anatomist used to controlling bodies, brushed Ambrose aside. They scuffled, quiet and furious, and in the struggle a small pistol discharged, not a weapon of modern invention, but a flint and steel pistol of the sort kept in pocket for matters of urgent defense. The shot struck the wall and sent plaster down in a cloud. For a breath Ambrose tasted dust and smoke, and felt the absurdity of a death that might have come to him in such a vulgar way. Kett, who had regained his nerve, flung a basket of linens in the path of March and yelled for the alley dogs. The noise, the falling papers, the sudden flare of the stove made March hesitate. It was enough Ambrose and Kett staggered through the back door and into the street, their breath ragged with fear and triumph. They ran until their legs refused to obey. The ledger had burned. The documents they had hoped to use as evidence were reduced to ash. March's calm had been decisive. He had known precisely which paper to destroy. Ambrose felt the floor shift beneath him. The network would cover itself in the absence of proof. Langford's containment had been surgical and now extended to the very instruments of justice. Yet the evening's catastrophe revealed something else, an error in the network. In his haste, March had left a scrap of paper under a chair, a corner of a map. Kett had the eye to see it. The scrap bore a list of addresses and a notation Northgate 3rd Unclaimed Deposit. Ambrose tucked the scrap into his coat as if it were a talisman. It gave them something to pursue, even as the ledger's flames consumed the rest. For several weeks, Ambrose and Kett worked in a half-light of terror and resolve. They could not go to the college. The hands of its counsel were already smooth. They could not rely on the coroner's board, for their columns joined Langford's in complacency. They had to be discreet. Ambrose used his office as a front to compile covertly. He borrowed records, wrote summaries that concealed the truth beneath the guise of administrative language, and when he could, he asked to be sent out on inquests that would place near the addresses on the scrap. Their investigation revealed a web wider and more organized than Ambrose had imagined. They mapped a series of mews and backrooms where bodies were received late at night, the numbers sewn into seams denoting not merely catalogue, but client. The unclaimed deposits were a euphemism in some cases. Entire families had been bought with bribes. In other places, magistrates had declared inquests unnecessary, where a private arrangement could be made. The network's beneficiaries included merchants who wanted inconvenient sons dead by appearance, and heirs who wished for the removal of inconvenient spouses. Men with means preferred a quiet accountancy of death to scandal, but the deeper they cut, the more they saw how this practice played into the city's moral architecture. For every ruined family that suffered the erasure, there were officials who preferred the peace of social order. Ambrose was haunted by the ordinary cruelties that born out of convenience. A woman whose lover vanished because his confidences had frightened a patron, a child whose parent died unclaimed because the father's debts made kinship a liability. As they closed a ring of witness and proof, Ambrose arranged for a meeting with a small, select group journalists of some reputation, a magistrate known to be incorruptible, and a member of Parliament sympathetic role. To reform. He showed them what he'd found, the scrap of addresses, the testimonies of Kett and Hobb, the pattern of repeated physical alterations in the corpses, the evidence of payment and expedience. There were gasps, and then, predictably, hesitation. The newspapers preferred rumour to fact. The magistrate feared the scandal's shock to public order. The Member of Parliament, one Lord Bellamy, frowned but recognized the political lethalness of taking on an eminent surgeon. "Are you certain you can substantiate a prosecution?" Bellamy asked, his voice taut with calculation. Ambrose opened his mouth to reply, and then closed it. He thought of March's steady hand and the way Langford's name slotted like a key into the complex locks of polite society. He could not promise the proof that would satisfy a tribunal. But there was another way, another blade. They arranged a public inquest, an inquest that could not easily be dismissed, and used their allies to ensure it would be well attended. Ambrose orchestrated situations in which altered bodies would be presented, where neutral witnesses, couriers, gravediggers might swear to the presence of entry passes and receipts. They made use of the press's appetite for novelty and horror. The story, when it reached the papers, did so not as a direct accusation, but as a hint of impropriety, a scandal suggested, not proclaimed. Ambrose called witnesses, like a chess player, trusting that a pattern would emerge beneath the initial silence. The gravedigger recited the frequent appearance of unmarked coffins delivered by a single set of coachmen. An undertaker, nervous and polite, spoke of small coins passed to avoid inquest costs. The journalists leaned forward. Langford's name was not yet in the air, but suspicion settled like a dust. The pressure mounted publicly in ways that paperwork never could. Families began, too, to speak up, the siblings who had been denied the right to claim a corpse, the mothers who had been told that their children had died and been buried anonymously. The reporters, sensing the story's teeth, demanded names. Langford's social allies, men of Parliament and magistrates, felt uncomfortable at the prospect of a scandal that involved missing kin. It was precisely the discomfort that made them seek quiet roads of escape. Under pressure, March made errors. He instructed a servant in a lie that he presumed would not be testable. The servant, frightened by the affairs in which he had been entangled, broke. He told, without being forced, of the mews and the small house where parcels were kept. A gravedigger, watching the undertaker's patterns, provided the names of the coaches that had taken bodies to certain graveyards. The reporters followed these leads with the appetite of foxes that smell blood. For a short time, it felt as if the network's discretion had cracked. The press printed accounts of unclaimed bodies, altered by unnamed cosmetic surgeons. The public imagined morbid salons where the rich reshaped death. Langford's name, when first used, was treated as absurd ridiculous. To think that a fellow of the Royal Society could stoop to such trade. But public sympathy turned against elites. With cruel speed, the mention of altered corpses, and of certain gentlemen whose estates had been settled without the scrutiny of heirs, produced a moral fury. Faced with exposure, Langford made a choice that revealed the final twist of the tale. He did not flee. He did not deny in fury. Instead, in a lecture that was turned into a public address, he conceded some of the facts, but reinterpreted them. He admitted that clinical restoration had been practiced among his pupils, but framed it as philanthropy carried too far. He offered to publish his methods and open them to scrutiny. He promised reform. The college, anxious to bury the scandal beneath the authority of its processors, summoned Langford and agreed to an inquiry that would be visible but controlled. Ambrose felt at first that victory had come. Langford, stripped of some authority and yet publicly taking the blame, allowed a reform pact to be negotiated. Bodies would be accounted for, more carefully registries would be public, apprentices would be watched. The mews houses were closed when judged necessary. Ket, who had risked much, was given a quiet pension and advised to leave the city. Hobb was found a berth that promised steadier wages. The press, satisfied with the drama's resolution, moved on. Ambrose's life after the inquiry was quieter. He continued his work as deputy coroner with a new vigilance and a sorrow that settled in the joints like an old rheumatism. He received, some months hence, a note from Ket informing him quietly that the professor had died abroad declared of apoplexy in a foreign inn, and that his house had been sold. Ambrose stood at Langford's funeral in a crowd of men who wore concern and plausible absence. The world had moved on. Yet Ambrose could not escape the sense that the city had been halted, its civic bones shaved and reshaped in ways that a single inquiry could not reverse. The practice of making identity fungible had left scars in the legal and social tissue. Families had been hollowed, records had gaps where people had been turned into unspecifiable artifacts. The dead had been traded like objects. The coroner, who had once loved neat ledgers and the honesty of cause, now kept a different catalogue in his private drawer, a list of those whose deaths he had not been able to amend, names that had been erased in polite haste. On a late autumn morning, Ambrose walked the cemeteries with a lantern, visiting graves that had once been unremarkable, but now stood as testimony. He left small notes upon certain stones, names, dates, a line or two about the circumstance. He could not revive the dead, nor mend the social economy that allowed erasure. But he could record, in the only way left to him, the truth that a name is not merely a convenience, but a thing of moral consequence. As he crossed Highgate that evening, his lantern guttering in the wind, he saw, reflected in the window of a passing carriage, his own face altered by the lamplight, flattened by distance. He thought of Langford's doctrine, that men could be made to look other than they were, whether in death or the delusion of living. He felt, with the last care of a man who had seen too much, that identity is as fragile as skin and as necessary as bone. The city, with its fog and its commerce of forgetting, would always shelter those who traded in disappearances. Where the law could not keep pace with the clever, the coroner must remain, as he had been, a slow and patient witness. And so, Dr. Ambrose Hale continued his watch, examining, naming, and, when necessary, naming anew, because a name, once spoken, is a small miracle of recognition.